Welcome back to the School of Muscle. Today I have on Ben Inglis joining me. Ben received a bachelor's degree in computer science and linguistics, so a little bit different than your typical background. Quick sidebar, I received my master's degree in exercise science, and I actually work as a full-time software engineer, so we kind of flipped roles from that perspective. But then Ben found his passion in was actually fitness. And at this point, he decided to pursue his master's degree in applied physiology and kinesiology. Ben now works remotely as a full-time strength and performance coach. And I believe it's for Barbell Medicine. Is that correct, Ben?
Yep, that's correct.
And I kind of found Ben through an article he wrote for Barbell Medicine titled Range of Motion Considerations. And that's kind of what we're going to dive in today. And we're more specifically going to kind of focus on range of motion considerations as it applies to muscle hypertrophy and getting more jacked. But we might cover some other things as we go here. So I think a good place for us to start here, Ben, is when discussing like full range of motion and partial range of motion, what are we kind of talking about here? As like some people might consider a full range of motion squat as to parallel, but that might not kind of be how it's defined in research and data and stuff. So what are we kind of talking about when we're saying full range of motion?
Yeah. First, I actually didn't realize you did that little flip from exercise phys to computer science or engineering. So software
Basically the
engineering.
opposite
So I think that's
of you.
hilarious. But yeah, this gave me a bit of trouble because I wasn't really finding a great definition when I was doing this. And I spent not too much time, but I spent a lot longer than you might expect, kind of poring over, like, how do I define range of motion without it being like a circular definition? Because yeah, range of motion is the motion, like it's the range at which the joint travels through during exercise, but that definition is kind of circular. It's like, yeah, range of motion is range of motion. So the way I like to define it is sort of the degree of movement occurring at a specific joint during an exercise. So not necessarily the movement of all joints, but kind of the joint of interest. And it can be increased or decreased. So like you said, quote unquote, full range of motion, I think of that as the majority of the available range of motion that we can take a joint through, versus partial, which would be either like one segment of that. So whether it's the beginning portion, the middle portion, or somewhere in between, or just the end portion, but you're not exercising that full range of motion. You're not going from like the smallest joint angle to the largest joint angle. You're just doing a smaller portion of that.
I think that's a good way to go about it. And I think it kind of lies on the spectrum, so to speak, to where it's kind of like you have fuller and kind of less full range of motion, in which like, there's like degrees within there to where one definition of partial range of motion might not be the same as others. And I can totally see how you had kind of a little bit difficulty like finding a non-circular way to kind of define that. But I think that's a good place to kind of use as reference as we're kind of talking about this concept. So I think that a good place to go from here is, before we get to the like research supporting partial and full range of motion, I think it'd be good to start with like, in what ways might range of motion help improve hypertrophic adaptations? So like, why should we even care about range of motion when it comes to kind of wanting to grow muscle?
Yeah. So in my article, I did talk about this. There are two plausible mechanisms here. So the first is that a larger range of motion is going to involve more muscle mass. So when you're talking about hypertrophy and we're driving it through debated mechanisms, but let's say primarily mechanical tension, maybe some metabolic factors, but larger range of motion is going to recruit more muscle mass, and that drives the maybe a better training adaptation because you're getting more recruited muscle mass, more tension on the muscle fibers per rep, basically. The second is another mechanism that is not completely been. I would say it's under some scrutiny right now, which is stretch mediated hypertrophy. So it's been studied, but the practical applications are not quite well understood. And that is another possible mechanism, is when you're kind of stretching the muscle fibers at those longer muscle lengths, there may be some increased like improved stimulus compared to the shorter muscle lengths.
Gotcha. So there is kind of mechanistic rationale for why your range of motion might be a independent contributor to muscle growth, in which it might make it important to use either a more full or kind of less full range of motion. So I think with that, you've kind of in your article, and I definitely recommend going to check out and reading through the article because you did a great job with kind of citing and referencing your studies that you looked at and all that stuff. And you touched on much more than just hypertrophic adaptations. You touched on strength and different things like that as well, if others are interested in that. So with that, when it comes to the kind of muscle adaptations regarding hypertrophy, what did the data kind of suggest in regards of supporting using a full range of motion?
The data here is, it seems that in general, a larger range of motion produces better hypertrophy outcomes. And there was actually just quite recently a meta-analysis that came out titled, where is it? Yeah, so the partial versus full range of motion resistance training, a systematic review and meta-analyses by Milo Wolf and colleagues. And that pretty much just came out. It was released this year, so hot off the press. And it pretty much confirmed my bias that in general, the data supports a relatively larger range of motion, with the caveat that there are some partial range of motions, particularly at longer muscle lengths. Although I think some of the majority of the data here is in isometrics. So you're not actually moving the muscle, you're just contracting, but the muscle is not shortening. But at longer muscle lengths, in addition to a few other, at least one other study doing bicep curls at long muscle lengths. So think about your elbow fully extended and then curling to like 45 degrees instead of a full bicep curl. Those may produce similar amounts of hypertrophy as a full range of motion, whereas the shorter muscle lengths, so if you're just doing a partial range of motion in that top portion of the bicep curl, may not. However, I think the consensus overall is that taking the muscle through the majority of its available range of motion produces the best hypertrophy training outcomes across the whole muscle.
Yeah, and I think Milo Wolf was also on the Revive Stronger podcast, in which Steve interviewed him about the study, and that was kind of my takeaway as well, in which it was kind of like, okay, using a full range of motion, it doesn't seem to really ever underperform using just that kind of bottom half of the range, but using that bottom half of the range seems like it can be as effective as using the full range, and you might see potentially worse outcomes if you just use the kind of more contracted range in the non-lengthened portion of it. So does that sound about kind of where you land as well?
Yeah, that's pretty much exactly where I land.
Cool. Well, I think from that, we can kind of get into what we already discussed a little bit here, but data supporting partial range of motion. I know you mentioned a few studies that have looked at this. This might kind of lead to a similar conclusion that we just came to, but what does that kind of data suggest on partial range of motion?
Yeah, there's a little bit of data here. I would say nothing like too compelling. So nothing that's going to make me like change the way I program dramatically. The big one was the isometrics at different muscle lengths. That one seemed to be a pretty kind of eye-opening, or at least definitely inspired some people to maybe think about practical applications of longer range of motion or longer muscle length for hypertrophy training. So that was the Oranchuk et al. 2018. And then there was another one. This one was interesting. I don't know if it's been replicated, but it actually had them doing tricep extensions, a 2019 study by Goto et al. And they were doing tricep extensions through the mid-range. So not necessarily just at the long muscle length, but through like that middle range, not just the end or the beginning. And I think one of their kind of what the authors suspected was maybe this has something to do with the blood flow. So increased metabolic stress because it's somewhat occluding the blood vessels by keeping it in that middle range and not not fully like extending or contracting the muscle.
Hmm.
Although I would like to see, I don't know if like I would really hang my hat on just one study. So
Hmm.
there's a little bit of data suggesting that longer range of motions do produce similar hypertrophy to full range of motion, but shorter muscle lengths, partial range of motion, do not. So again, that leads us to the same conclusion that it's almost it's almost always at least as beneficial to use full range of motion compared to longer range of motion, with the caveat that there may be some times in training when you either want to finish a set with like get a little more volume and like rep out those bottom partials, or
Hmm.
maybe just try a different style of training that would uh, has a both mechanistic and somewhat supported by the data rationale.
Hmm. Yep, absolutely. And just to go to back to our example earlier, because some of this can be kind of difficult to visualize if someone's just listening to
Yeah,
this.
yeah,
If you're doing like a bicep curl,
sure.
what we're saying is that when you're at the kind of bottom position before you curl the weight up at all, if you just came like halfway up to like 90 degrees, like parallel with the floor, that range of motion right there in that more kind of lengthened position of the bicep might be similarly effective to producing hypertrophy compared to using a full range of motion in which you bring your arm all the way up towards your shoulder and you fully contract your bicep. However, using that full range, it never really seems to be worse than just using that bottom
Hmm.
end. And on the flip side of this, if you started just at that kind of 90-degree angle with your arm halfway up, kind of your body, so to speak, and you just brought it up to your shoulder and you kept it in kind of the more contracted range, that seems like it could potentially be worse compared to the other two variations of training it in a more lengthened position or just using the full range. Does that sound like I'm understanding that correctly?
Yeah, that's exactly it. And in one of the limitations I would say is that these studies are usually looking at just one exercise. So it does make it a little bit difficult to generalize to all
Hmm.
exercises. And especially when we're looking at, small sample sizes, relatively small effect sizes, like underpowered data here.
Yeah.
Um, and the other issue I see with that potentially in the gym is just kind of a shifting of the goalposts where, like, you say you're doing partial reps, but you're actually just decreasing the range of motion. Um, like you're not in a research setting where they have you on like an isokinetic dynamometer with a fixed angle. It's like, are you really doing partial range of motion reps at a long muscle length, or are you just shortening the range of motion till it's non-existent?
Yep, absolutely. I think that is one big practical consideration of this is if someone's, especially if someone's like tracking performance and they like in their program have that they're going to do some partials here, it's going to be really difficult for them to know, am I actually progressing my strength here or am I just making my partial even more of a partial and kind of reducing that range of
Exactly.
motion even more? And I would say that's kind of a problem for people when they're even trying to do full range of motion exercises is they kind of fool themselves into thinking they're progressing when in reality they're just kind of letting their kind of technique get a little bit worse or they're using a little bit less range of motion and stuff like that. So I think that leads us right into kind of practical considerations of this. Like, are you practically changing the programs you write for clients based on some of this data coming out about full range of motion versus partial range of motion? Or what do you kind of think are some considerations on that kind of like programming level for someone trying to build as much muscle as they can?
The majority of the programs I write that are based or designed for building as much muscle as possible are going to be using mostly full range of motion exercises. Um, the one thing I don't know, because I think this data was out there enough when I was really starting to write programs, is that sometimes I'll add some like partial reps at the end if I want to get a little extra volume or a little more stimulus for a muscle group that's either lagging, or sometimes you'll prioritize certain body parts during certain training cycles. So if say we're focusing on the side delts, I might have them do a set of lateral raises, and then instead of finishing the set when they can't do any more complete reps, I'll have them rep out like the bottom partials, because I think that's a relatively low fatigue cost way to get some extra stimulus, because it's pretty isolated movement. We're not going to generate too much fatigue. We're not going to be doing those all the time, but for maybe a training block, see if we can get a little more growth. Other than that, the only other practical situation where I'll change range of motion is really if somebody's dealing with like a nagging pain or injury and we need to modify training for them to be able to complete it all. Or if they just have a really strong preference, like if somebody's like, no, I'm only going to do leg extensions for the bottom half range of motion. Like, cool. That's fine with me.
Yeah. Yep.
What about you?
So I actually, before this podcast, I have the benefit of knowing what questions I'm going to ask. And I wrote down a couple of practical situations and you covered them both. So one of them was one of them was working around injury, in which, like, say a client, for whatever reason, when they come to like a full range of motion on a certain lift, it bothers them a little bit, but maybe it doesn't bother them when they're just working in that lengthened position. Then that's great. We can probably get pretty good stimulus from doing that and kind of avoid aggravating potentially what they're kind of dealing with. And just as a sidebar, Barbell Medicine has a bunch of great resources on kind of dealing with pain while training and kind of working through some of that stuff. So I definitely recommend checking them out for that. So kind of working around injuries and doing things like that was one. And then also, like you said, just kind of like more of as an add-on to maybe if kind of stretch immediate hypertrophy is a thing. And if we also conclude that training in that lengthened position probably isn't worse than training in that kind of full range of motion in certain instances, then doing a little bit of extra kind of partial reps in that full range for, especially like you said, for muscle groups that we're prioritizing or that we're really trying to focus on, I think that there's kind of little downside to just eking out a few extra reps, kind of like you said. So yeah, those are basically the two practical situations that I was thinking of as well.
Cool. Yeah, sounds like we're on the same page. I don't know that I'm at the point where I would have only longer range of motion or longer muscle length partial reps. I think at the moment I would program them afterwards or as more of like a drop set. It's like some type of drop set. Is there a specific name for that when you're using a
partial instead of like full
lowering
range
the
of
weight?
motion for drop sets?
Yeah.
I think, I don't know. I would just say drop sets where you use partials. I don't know.
Sure,
There might be
yeah.
a term out there, but I think not one that I know.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know I'm at the point where I would have someone do like just lateral raises, like heavy lateral raises with just the bottom portion, or just pull-ups in that like bottom stretch position. I would have them do it either like after as a separate exercise, or like I said, as more of a drop set. But I think that's probably the biggest application.
Yep. I would say I'm in the same boat, in which I wouldn't be comfortable yet just programming like an entire mesocycle of these partials in the lengthened position. But maybe, like, say I have 4 or 5 different chest exercises within someone's entire training week for their chest. Maybe I choose one of those exercises that focuses a little bit more on that lengthened position. Or maybe for one of those exercises, we do some sort of a drop set, or I just tell the client that, hey, once you finish this set, I want you to try to do almost kind of like mile reps or some additional reps following just in that partial range, just to provide a little bit more stimulus there. And if stretch mediated hypertrophy ends up being, kind of important, we're kind of hedging our bets here, and it doesn't seem like it's going to be any worse for hypertrophy. And it also might just provide a little bit of a novel way to train to make things a little bit more interesting and make the client enjoy it a little bit more.
Yeah, maybe you'll get a even sicker pump from it. Who knows? I think I do, especially for biceps. I find that those long in biceps and triceps, like those overhead extensions, I'll always take those like to failure and then use I'll do a single arm tricep extensions, one of my favorites right now, and then use that use your other hand to get the weight up just so you can get the nice stretch at the bottom. My God, get the nastiest tricep pump from those, man.
Yep, absolutely. The example I was thinking of is like an overhead dumbbell tricep extension, which you're kind of towards the end and you can just kind of keep the weight bouncing a little bit in that fully stressed range, and you can use a little bit of momentum there. I think that definitely leads to pretty sick pumps. And if cellular swelling is a potential mechanism of hypertrophy, probably less so than mechanical tension, but there's some research suggesting that the actual swelling of the tissue might be beneficial for hypertrophy, then doing some things like this might be beneficial. Now, you could also make the argument that you could use full range of motion techniques to do this as well, and just do like drop sets or giant sets and different things like that, or supersetting the same exercise or other things like that. But I think that this might also kind of hit two birds with one stone of getting that cellular swelling plus stretch mediated hypertrophy and different things like that.
And I think that cellular swelling, that was, I think, the mechanism I was alluding to with that one tricep extension study, actually.
Gotcha. Where they were kind of just working in that middle range and trying to keep kind of tension on the muscle and improving that. Gotcha. Cool. Well, I think that this kind of covers partial and full range of motion pretty well overall. If you could kind of just give a few kind of key takeaways to leave the listener with when thinking about range of motion and hypertrophy, what would kind of those few key takeaways be?
Yeah, I think the key takeaway is that you're going to get better and adapt to the things that you do. So if you want to maximize your muscle growth across the whole muscle, you probably want to be taking that muscle and loading it through the majority of its available range of motion, with the caveat that there might be some mechanisms and some potential there for training at longer muscle lengths for hypertrophy. With that said, I wouldn't spend the majority of your training time in that range. But it could be one way to make training a little more interesting, or squeeze out a little more training volume in hopes of maybe generating a slightly larger stimulus there.
Perfect. And the only addition I would make to that is that when making these considerations, using partial range of motion, it's probably best to use that partial range of motion in that kind of more lengthened position of an exercise versus to kind of more that shortened position. But yeah, everything else I totally agree with, and I think those are some great takeaways. So Ben, thank you so much for joining me today. If someone was like, hey, I want to make sure I can find this article or other articles you write or other stuff that you're doing, where can people find you?
Of course. I'm on all social media, I think, at Ben_Barbell Medicine. So Instagram, I'm probably most active on right now. I've recently started to try and revive my TikTok account because I was doing pretty well on there for a while, but then, man, some of that information and it's just not good for my mental health. But if you want this article in particular, which does cover more than just hypertrophy, even though that's what we're really all here for, that's the most important part of lifting weights.
Of life, really.
Of life, yeah. That's why we're all here on this earth, to get as jacked as possible.
Pretty much.
Yeah, search up range of motion considerations, and then probably barbell medicine, and it should come up. If not, I think you can access it through my Instagram link in bio.
Yep, you do have it on your link tree. I will definitely confirm that. And yeah, sidebar on TikTok, I posted like twice. I was like, I'm done with this, and I'm going back to long form content. But we could probably go down a benefits and downsides of social media rabbit hole here, but we'll spare the audience for that. So thank you so much for coming on today, Ben. I really appreciate it, and I think that you gave some really good takeaways, and I appreciate the articles you're writing and the content you're producing as well.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. It's been a pleasure.